Hello everybody and welcome to the Mio Lesson channel. This episode is a follow-up of my OM1 review that I published a few weeks earlier, and I'm going to talk about autofocus and stabilization settings, as well as giving you ideas on how to customize the camera. Before we begin, I just want to say that I'm not going to review every single setting you find on the OM1. There are a lot of them, so I'll concentrate on those that I believe are the most important to know about. On my website, mirrorlesscomparison.com, you'll find a text version of this video with extra information. So if you want to know more, please visit the article. The link is in the description below. Okay, let's get started. In the previous episode, I explained how the bird subject detection mode is crucial to maximize your keeper rate for static and moving subjects. I also explained how it works in conjunction with the autofocus target setting, but there are a few extra things I want to explain on this topic. The autofocus target is designed to restrict the area where the camera focuses. There are 9 options to choose from, including 4 custom target modes where you can create any size that you need. These settings are useful to tell the camera which subject you want to focus on. The OM1 detects any birds present in the frame, but the target's position and size determines which ones gets priority. Now, there is a very important thing to understand. The OM1 can focus on a subject that is either inside the target area or around the target area, provided that the subject is close enough to that area. This is a crucial thing to know because it can help you improve the performance and the results with the camera. Here we have the large target in green and the white frames around the 2 birds detected by the camera. The green area and the white areas overlap, so in a situation like this, the OM1 will choose the swan or the duck automatically. You don't have an immediate control on who gets priority. Let's say you want the swan in focus. The quickest solution is to move the large target over it. There is enough distance between the 2 subjects, so the target won't overlap with the white area on the right, and the camera will only concentrate on the swan. Here is another scene with a cormorant on the left and a great black-backed gull on the right, and they are much closer to one another. The large target won't work well because even if I position it on the cormorant, part of it will still overlap with the other bird's area. You would think the camera is smart enough to understand that the cormorant is the subject I want because I moved the target over it, but in my experience, the OM1 can hesitate. It can ignore the target position and focus on the less obvious subject depending on the light conditions or the position of the bird itself or who knows what, or it can even switch randomly from one to the other. A smaller target like cross could help, but as you can see, there is still a small part of it that overlays with the gull's focus area, and unfortunately that can be enough to trigger some confusion in the camera. The better solution in this case is to use the small autofocus target. That way, there is no risk of the target touching the gull's detected area, and you're guaranteed that the OM1 will only focus on the cormorant. Note that you don't need to place the target precisely on the head of the bird. The camera will take care of that automatically thanks to the subject detection mode. The takeaway is that with 2 or more subjects in your frame, a small autofocus target will give the camera a better indication on who is the subject you want to focus on. Now, this relationship between subject detection and the autofocus target may appear to lack precision, but there are situations where it becomes very useful. The following images are an example of bad tracking from my part. I couldn't keep the red kite at the center and inside the large target. However, because the bird detected area was overlapping with the target area, the camera was able to maintain focus. Even a small overlap like the one shown here is enough for the OM1 to keep focus on the subject. This means you don't need the largest target available even when you're struggling to keep the subject at the center of the frame. In my experience, most of the time the camera was able to maintain focus on the bird in flight even when it was at the edge of the frame. Of course, it won't work if it is too far from the focus area, but something like the large target should be big enough for most situations. Another example where the size of the AF target can help is when the camera is focusing on the foreground or another area rather than the subject itself. This happened to me on multiple occasions, I already showed you example with birds near water or near a field, but I can show you additional examples with a motorbike race. In this sequence, we have the biker far in the distance, and I initially used the cross target, but I noticed the camera would often switch to the biker behind him because his focus area and the cross target briefly overlapped. I'm not sure why the camera would want to choose the subject in the background rather than the one in front, but unfortunately that can happen. Changing to the small target solved the problem. Perhaps a future firmware update will improve this whole behavior and make it easier for us to choose whatever target we want, but in the meantime, choosing the right setting can help you in these situations. The second example is something I've already mentioned in my review. In this particular corner, the OM-1 had a bad habit of choosing the tarmac or the grass in the foreground rather than the biker in the middle of the corner. Here as well, the small target solved the problem. With birds in flight near water or grass, you can also try a custom target with a horizontal shape and position it slightly upwards so that the water or the grass at the bottom of the image are excluded as much as possible. Face and eye detection for people works differently. It is not part of the AI subject detection mode, but is another setting altogether. Furthermore, the behavior of the camera is a bit different. You can activate face and eye detection in the menu or super control panel, and you have different options like giving priority to the left or right eye. Avoid the face only option as you may end up with the eyes slightly soft. In the AF menu on page 2, there is a setting called Face and Eye AF button where you can choose to give priority to the person or the autofocus target. If you choose face priority, the camera overrides any autofocus target size and position. For example, if the person is on the right and the autofocus target is on the left, the camera will ignore the target and focus on the person. This specific behavior is not available with the AI subject detection mode. If you choose target priority, the opposite happens. The camera will focus on the left and ignore the person on the right, even if her face and eyes are detected. The same happens when using AI subject detection. Also, with target priority, the camera ignores the eye of the person even if the autofocus target is positioned on that person. For example, if the small target is on the mouth, that's where the camera will focus, even though face and eyes are detected, effectively taking away the advantage of this function in the first place. So I would recommend to use face priority. If there is more than one person in your scene and you want to focus on one of them in particular, there is another setting you can use called face selection. First, you want to assign face selection to a function button, then press and hold that button and use one of the two dials to quickly switch between the different faces. This is something that would be nice to have for animals as well, as it is a quicker way to jump from one subject to the other rather than moving the autofocus point. Like most Olympus cameras, the OM-1 has two settings for continuous autofocus. Continuous AF, which tracks the subject within the autofocus target you selected. If you choose all target, it gives priority to the center. Continuous AF plus tracking, where after the initial acquisition, the camera tracks the subject on the entire frame, regardless of the autofocus target's size and position. In my test with birds in flight, I didn't find a substantial difference with the keeper rate between the two modes, as long as bird subject detection was active. Autofocus tracking can be useful for subjects that move very erratically, and you want the camera to be able to follow them no matter where they are in the frame. Now remember that you need to lock focus on the bird or animal in order to track it correctly. Personally, I prefer the normal continuous autofocus mode when working with subject detection because, as I just explained, the camera is able to follow a bird not only when it is inside the autofocus target, but also when it is around it. I find large target plus continuous AF to be the best configuration for birds in flight. Also, being able to control the focus area reduces the chance of the camera focusing elsewhere, something that is not possible when using the autofocus tracking mode. The OM1 has a lot of settings to control the autofocus and how it responds to different situations. Many of these settings are the same found in previous OMD cameras, and you may recognize them from my previous tutorial about the EM1 Mark III and Birds in Flight video, which I'll link in the description. AF sensitivity works in -2 or +2 steps. Positive values increase the sensitivity, making the camera more reactive to rapid changes in distance or speed. A more reactive autofocus works better for fast-moving subjects. If you have a young child who never stops moving, for example, a positive value of +1 or +2 will help. The same reasoning applies to the red kites, but it also means that the camera will switch focus more easily if a second bird enters the frame in the foreground, as you can see here. In my case, it only happened a couple of times, but if you see this behavior increase in your shooting condition, try setting it to 0. AF sensitivity is very useful for a multitude of applications. In a motorbike race, for example, your subject can be covered momentarily by other bikes in front of him and exiting a corner. In the first set, I had AF sensitivity to +1 and the camera changed focus as soon as the bikes were in front of my subject. A bit later, I reduced the AF sensitivity to -1 and this time the focus didn't jump on the bikes in front, but remained on the biker behind. Pre-manual focus allows you to save a precise focus distance that you can recall at any time. There are two ways to configure this function. The first method is the manual mode, and it works if you already know which distance to set. You go in the menu, AF section page 6, and choose Preset MF Distance. Then input the distance that you wish. The second method is the automatic mode, and that helps you find the distance with the help of autofocus. First of all, press the AF metering button on top of the camera, scroll to PreMF, then you want to press the info button. Once you know where to focus, half press the shutter release button to focus on the desired point in your scene. Alternatively, you can also move the focus ring and set it manually. Press the OK button and the distance is saved. What is interesting with the second method is that it shows you the exact distance on the display. If you're taking pictures in the same location, perhaps in the same height where the bird comes and goes, you can set the distance to a particular tree branch or a perch, for example. And if the camera suddenly misfocuses and goes too short or too far, you can quickly recall that focus distance you just saved and have the camera focus properly again. It works really well. Pre-MF can be assigned to a function button, making the recall instantaneous. If your lens has a focus limit switch on the barrel, make sure that it doesn't conflict with the distance you just saved. Something you need to know is that pre-manual focus is a manual focus mode. Once activated, you can no longer focus automatically. One solution is to turn on the option called AF on in manual focus mode, which allows you to use the AF on button to focus in single mode while working with PreMF. If you want continuous AF, however, you will have to go back to it manually with the AF metering button. If you want to revert to continuous AF more quickly, a second workaround is to use the rear function lever. Go to Operations menu, page 1, Function lever settings, and choose Mode 2. Then exit the menu and set continuous autofocus for both positions 1 and 2. When you switch to pre-manual focus, you only need to move the lever to position 1 or 2 to go back to the continuous autofocus mode. AF limiter is a setting that many readers or viewers on this channel have suggested to me as a way to improve the keeper rate with birds in flight, specifically to avoid focusing on the background. Traditionally, AF limiter is found in the form of a physical button on the barrel of long telephoto lenses. For a while now, Olympus/OM has given us the option to customize this in camera. You can create up to 3 presets with any minimum and maximum distance that you wish. Unfortunately, you can only input the distances manually. There isn't an option to set the range using the autofocus, like you can do with the pre-manual focus mode that I just described a few minutes ago. That said, you can use pre-manual focus to determine which distances you need to set. First of all, select PreMF with the AF metering button, press the info button, focus on the area you want to exclude, trees in the background for example, and take note of the distance you see on the display. Go to the AF menu, page 3, and choose AF limiter. Set the maximum focus distance about 10 meters or 20 meters shorter than what pre-manual focus showed you, or even less if you know the animal won't go near that area. Once the distances are set, activate AF limiter and switch to continuous autofocus. Alternatively, you can guess the distance and test it to see if the camera still focuses on the background or not. If it still is, you reduce the distance until it can no longer focus on the trees or whatever area you want the autofocus to ignore. In the AF limiter setting, you also find a release priority option. I would advise to leave this off, at least initially, so that you can assess if the autofocus range is working. If the camera refuses to take images, you'll know that the distance is too short. AF limiter can be very helpful, but it's important to keep in mind a few things. First of all, it didn't make a big difference with my test with the red kites when it comes to the keeper rate. Although the camera didn't focus on the background as much, other type of autofocus shots and slightly soft images remain, and the latter are more frequent than completely autofocus images, and autofocus limiter can help you with that. Second, when setting autofocus limiter, consider all the possible areas where the bird might fly in order to have enough range to cover every direction. Third, don't forget autofocus limiter is engaged. If suddenly you see a different bird up in the sky and it is out of the autofocus range, you'll end up with an entire sequence out of focus if you chose release priority, or the camera won't even focus at all. The best thing is to assign AF limiter to a function button so that you can quickly enable it or disable it. Last but not least, remember to set the AF limiter switch on your lens to full if there is one. This setting determines whether the camera should capture a photo even when it is out of focus. You can configure it for single AF and continuous AF, which also includes AF tracking. Which option you choose really comes down to how much you trust the autofocus on your camera. If I have a Sony A9 Mark II, I could easily set release priority and forget about it because the autofocus of that camera will deliver. A product like the OM-1 is also really good, but there are moments, as I showed you already, where the autofocus can struggle. So I prefer to keep this option off and have focus priority. You will still get autofocus images, but there is less risk of having a higher percentage of them because the camera gives more importance to focus accuracy rather than releasing the shutter. One argument against using focus priority is that drive speed can slow down when the camera is struggling with the autofocus, but to be fair, I never experienced something drastic with the OM1. Plus, for my work on this channel, where I evaluate the autofocus of many cameras, focus priority just gives me a more precise idea of what each camera is capable of. That said, there can be situations where it is more important for you to capture the highest amount of images possible. Maybe it's a one-time opportunity that you won't witness again, and in that case, you want to have release priority on and hope that the autofocus will cope. This is another setting that gets mentioned to me from time to time, and I often have the impression that not everybody understands what it is really about. Basically, you can choose whether or not to display the green autofocus points that indicate where the camera is focusing. On 1 will display one focus point briefly when the camera is focusing. On 2 will show multiple points for all the areas that are in focus on the subject, and this is also called the cluster mode. This is the setting I use personally because I like to see how the autofocus behaves on screen. To avoid any confusion, if there is some, understand that this setting is only a visualization aid, if we can call it this way, on the EVF or LCD monitor. It does not affect the autofocus performance. Whether you decide to see the green points on screen or not, the camera behaves in the same way. The autofocus settings such as single, continuous, tracking, face and eye detection, and subject detection are available for video as well. Note that you need to work with continuous AF plus tracking in order to activate the AI subject detection mode, unlike for still photos. CAF speed determines how fast the camera changes focus. Choose fast and it will do it more rapidly. Choose slow and it will shift focus less rapidly, which can also give you a smoother and more pleasant transition between 2 points in your image. Unfortunately, it only works in plus or minus one step, which is not a lot to fine tune the speed. For wildlife work, I would keep it either to 0 or plus 1 if the subject is moving fast. Like the equivalent setting for stills, CAF sensitivity determines how quickly the camera reacts when the distance to the subject changes. A high value will make the OM1 more reactive with fast moving subjects, whereas 0 or minus 1 will make the AF more stable if the subject is not moving a lot, or if it is briefly obscured by other elements. In photo mode, there are 4 different settings accessible from the menu, section 1, page 8, or the Super Control panel. With IS Auto, the camera compensates in all directions, or it can compensate only vertically or horizontally if it detects there is movement. With IS1, it compensates in all directions. Choose IS2 and it compensates vertical motion only, and with IS3, the OM1 corrects horizontal motion only. For normal use, I always leave this setting to IS1. For the motorbike race or any motorsport event, I would choose IS2, so vertical compensation only. For birds in flight, there are a few options. You can leave it to auto and let the camera do the work, but I'm not sure how good it is in switching automatically between vertical direction or all direction, for example. So I'd rather have more input on what the camera does. I would prefer IS2 or IS3 depending on the direction of the flight, that is, if you can predict that direction easily. Keep also in mind that if you're using a fast shutter speed, 1/2000 of a second or faster, you can turn stabilization off. The exposure time should be safe to ensure sharpness, so stabilization is not essential. The only reason to keep it on is to have the stabilization effect in the viewfinder, which is something that can help you compose your photos better if the subject is not moving too fast. With animals or birds that move really fast or move erratically, I would keep stabilization off, also because you may notice sudden shifts or jerks in the EVF, and that can make you less precise with the composition. With this setting, you can choose to give priority to the drive speed or the image stabilization during continuous shooting. With IS priority, the camera recenters the sensor for each frame, which reduces the drive speed a little. If you're using a slower than normal shutter speed and don't need a super fast continuous shooting speed, you can choose this option to ensure better results. With FPS priority, so frame per second priority, the sensor is not recentered each time, so the drive speed is not affected, but stabilization can be less effective. This is the one I tend to use because most of the time I don't see a relevant drop in stabilization performance. If you're using a Panasonic lens with optical stabilization, you can choose to give priority to either sensor stabilization on the camera or optical stabilization on the lens. Panasonic lenses are not compatible with SyncIS on Olympus OM bodies. With long focal lengths like the ones we use for sports or wildlife, I would choose optical over sensor stabilization. Note that this option has no effect if the lens has a OS switch on the barrel that takes over, and you can make the same decision with the physical button instead. Just a quick note about the Olympus 100 to 400mm. This lens has optical stabilization but is not compatible with SyncIS. The IBIS on the camera and the IS on the lens can be used independently, unlike SyncIS where you activate everything or nothing at the same time. If both are enabled, the roll axis on the sensor is combined with pitch and yaw on the lens. Some of you might suggest that the same happens with Panasonic lenses, but I never had a chance to verify this myself. There are two main settings for movie recording. MIS1, that is sensor plus electronic stabilization. It improves the result with static shots, but crops the field of view a little as a result, which can be useful for wildlife anyway. MIS2 is sensor stabilization only, which is best for fast movements or if you don't want to lose the original field of view of your lens. Finally, there is the IS level and it works in 3 steps. -1 makes the stabilization more forgiving of movements and is recommended when panning or tracking. +1 increases the stability for static shots. However, be careful because even the slightest movement of your hand or body can translate in big jerks in your footage. Personally, I prefer to leave it to 0. The OM-1 offers a great level of customization. You can even go as far as changing which lever powers the camera on and off. Now, customizing a camera takes time. If this is your first mirrorless or your first Olympus/OM camera, my advice is to start with the default setup and gradually change things as you learn which settings you're using more than others. For reference, you can see here how I configured mine so far based on my personal needs. It's not a final configuration, I might tweak it further as I learn the camera inside out. You can see it as a starting point if you don't like the default setup, but you're not sure what to change first. I always like the 2 function buttons near the mount because your fingers reach them naturally, so I thought it was useful to assign there 2 of the settings I work with the most. A quick press of the top button and you turn subject detection on or off. If you press and hold, you can change the type of subject with the front or rear dial, which is handy. Here's a tip for you. If you need to switch quickly between human and animal detection, make sure to keep face and eye detection for humans enabled. When you press the button, it will activate animal AF and deactivate human detection. Press it again and the opposite happens. And as you can see, it's very quick. On the second button below, I assign face selection to quickly switch from one person to the other when using face and eye detection, like I showed you earlier on in the video. The SOVF option disables the exposure, picture mode, and white balance preview, giving you a more natural and brighter view in DVF or LCD screen. I find this useful when following fast subjects in difficult light conditions like backlight for example, where the exposure preview might change too often while shooting or become too dark. Unfortunately, it doesn't work with the fastest speeds of 50 or 120 frames per second. AF on starts the autofocus. This is the back button focus method where you engage focus with the rear button rather than half pressing the shutter release button. This is the first thing I set with any camera I test. To do that, you have to disable the option called AF by half pressing the shutter button in the menu, which is found in the AF section, page 1. What I like about this solution is that I hardly need to switch to single autofocus. Press quickly to focus once, press and hold to focus continuously. I find this to work really well for any type of subject, whether they're still or moving. The AL button is set to pre-manual focus, which is a function I explained earlier on. I use the lever around the button to switch between PreMF and continuous autofocus. Alternatively, you can use the lever to switch between 2 sets of focus mode, focus target, and target position. For example, position 1 can have single AF and small target, whereas position 2 can use large target and continuous autofocus. Note that any change you make in either of these positions at any time will override the previous one, and you may find that a bit annoying. You can limit the amount of settings that can be changed with the function lever if you wish. For example, in my configuration, I only selected the AF mode and deselected the target size and target position. Home AF allows you to quickly recall a specific AF target and position. For now, I've assigned this to single target, which is the smallest point, in case I suddenly need to focus on a precise area. What would be great about Home AF is the possibility of going back to the previous target with the same button. Basically, one press would activate Home AF, a second press would go back to the previous target I was using. I guess I'll add this to my wishlist. If your lens has a function button, you can assign a custom setting there as well. With a prime lens such as the 300mm Pro, you may want to try to use it to engage autofocus, so set AF on. If you find the position comfortable, it can be an interesting solution where you control focus with your left hand and you take picture with your right hand. I found this especially useful with Pro Capture when I was trying to photograph small birds in flight near a feeder. The action was so fast and brief that I had to time everything precisely. Being able to start the autofocus and Pro Capture with my left hand on the lens made it so that my right hand's only job was to press the shutter button, nothing else. The method works best with primes. With zooms, you may need to change the focal length, meaning that you would have to constantly switch between the zoom ring and the function button, so that becomes more uncomfortable. For video, I prefer to have AF stop enabled on the lens button so that I can briefly halt the autofocus while recording. Finally, there are My Menu and the custom modes, which can be accessed from the main dial. My Menu has 5 pages with 7 slots each. You can save a setting in it at any time while navigating the menu by pressing the red recording button. The custom modes allow you to save a lot of different parameters, from image quality to autofocus settings and function buttons. You can create different setups for different shooting needs. For example, I configure C1 for static birds, C2 for birds in flight, and C3 is for portrait of my toddler. You can recall the custom modes with function buttons too, if you prefer, and that is actually the quickest way to recall all your favorite settings at once. And that's it, I believe. As a reminder, you also find the article on my website with everything I just said plus extra information, so make sure to give that a visit. And I'll finish by showing you a list of recommended settings for different shooting conditions. Let me know if they work for you, or otherwise, don't hesitate to leave a comment with your suggestion about the best settings to use. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.